Hi, everybody. So welcome. I can't see you, and this is going to be a factor in the discussion. But really welcome, and I suppose most of all, I just wish I was there with you. I mean, I wish we were all together and we could walk and gossip and meet in the corridors and hug. And anyway, so I hope next year we'll meet again, maybe on a critique of post-liberal, of which I'm one. So I'm Hilary Wainwright. I'm from Red Pepper magazine, and I'm really, really excited about this conference and very excited about this book, which I'm assuming you've all got, and you'll be giving as presents to every Guardian reader you know who hasn't already got it. Anyway, just to very quickly move on to this session, this opening session, I think it's really indicative of the political sharpness of this book, that we're starting with a session on the establishment, because I think one of the contradictions of liberalism is that it's good on championing the injustices, but it's very weak and often kind of falls back when it comes to challenging the sources of power that produce that injustice. And that means the establishment, in a way, as a code word for dominating power. And I think that there's no one better to talk about that establishment, to reveal that, the workings of that establishment, and who's been doing so, as Mark Curtis. I'm just going to, because I haven't quite got everything in his about his biography, but he's been working on exposing the establishment for many, many years. He's produced several books, well, 5 books about British foreign policy: Web of Deceit, Britain's Real Role in the World, Unpeopled, Britain's Secret Human Rights Abuses, and most recently, Secret Affairs, Britain's Collusion with Radical Islam. These books have drawn on Britain's declassified documents, have been widely acclaimed as uncovering numerous hidden episodes in the UK's post-1945 foreign policy, and for rewriting the true history of Britain's role in the world in this period. So, you know, he's absolutely the ideal person. He's a former research fellow at the Royal Institute of International Affairs, i.e. Chatham House, and was a visiting fellow at the Institut Français de Relations Internationales in Paris and the Deutsche Gesellschaft für Auswärtige Politik in Bonn. He's a graduate of Goldsmiths College, London, University of London, and a postgraduate of the LSE. He's written as a freelance journalist for various media for 30 years, including The Guardian, which he'll talk about. He also worked in the international development NGO world for 25 years. He was previously director of the World Development Movement, now the fantastic Global Justice Now, and head of policy at international NGOs, ActionAid and Christian Aid. From 2005 to 2018, Mark managed Curtis Research, his own research consultancy, covering international development and foreign policy issues. He conducted field research in 15 African countries, visiting the continent 50 times, and produced over 130 reports for over 40 NGOs. So he's particularly well equipped and experienced. And he'll talk particularly about, or draw from, the work of his own organization, well, with Matt Kennard, builds on and sort of continues the tradition of revealing the otherwise secret world of the British establishment. So Mark, over to you. Now, first, before you talk, I've just got to say to everybody that unfortunately we won't be able to see you or hear you, but you won't be silent. There'll be the chance to ask questions, you know, make comments through the chat. And if you can put your questions into the chat, and then the wonderful Naeem is going to pull them together and pass them to me for me to put them in sort of bunches of 3. And I also want to thank Stephanie, who's here in the background, in case I muddle up with Robin. It seems pretty much like Zoom, but I feel there's some hidden trap that I'm going to fall into. Anyway, lovely to be here, and over to Mark.
Thanks very much, Hilary. your work is something that I've long valued and respected as one of the key strategic thinkers in the country. So thanks very much for introducing me. And thanks for organizing the conference to Goldsmiths Media Research Center, and especially to members of the center, Des Friedman, James Curran, Justin Schlossberg, Natalie Fenton, among others, whose media analysis has long been extremely valuable, I think. And it's an honor to be able to do this talk. Thank you for inviting me. In the distant past, I wrote some comment pieces for The Guardian, as Hilary was saying, but in recent years, I've spent a lot of time analyzing how the national press and broadcasters, including The Guardian, report on UK foreign policy, Britain's role in the world. And we at Declassified UK have recently published several in-depth critical analyses of this media reporting. And the basic issue is that there is a massive difference between the reality of that UK foreign policy and how it's reported in the UK media. Maybe millions of readers of The Guardian and its sister paper, The Observer, believe that it offers critical, independent reporting and that it's very different to the right-wing, billionaire-controlled UK media. But my analysis is that The Guardian plays a key role in misinforming the UK public and in upholding the British establishment. Now, I want to present something new today. I've done a content analysis of reporting by The Guardian and Observer on UK foreign policies, covering the 2 years from April 2019 to March 2021. I haven't covered all The Guardian's output since there are thousands of articles, but I have looked in detail at several key UK foreign policy issues. And my research identifies 5 key trends in Guardian reporting, which I wanted to outline today. The first one is that The Guardian's worldview promotes the establishment myths of benign British and American power. So a leading Guardian columnist wrote an article in February listing the world's bad guys. Across the world, he wrote, the bad guys are winning. And his list included Burma, China, Russia, North Korea, Syria, and Ethiopia, but he didn't mention the UK or the US. A few months before that, another influential columnist listed Assad of Syria, Orban of Hungary, Putin of Russia, Bolsonaro of Brazil, Modi of India, Netanyahu of Israel, and Donald Trump as the world's bad guys. But again, not the UK. Now, I think these listings are telling, and they signify how The Guardian and Observer report on the world and the UK's place within it. The UK is seen as one of the good guys. To the editors of The Observer, post-war Britain has always championed a rules-based international order, they wrote recently. And they claim that this rules-based world order is now under threat from the likes of Vladimir Putin and Chinese leader Xi Jinping. Again, the leaders designated as enemies by the British government, but not from Britain. So when an Observer editorial last May covered the importance of the United Nations, it lamented only Russian, Chinese, and Trump's years of undermining the UN, but again didn't mention Britain. But the fact is that Britain is also a rogue state when it comes to upholding the rulings and values of the United Nations, or any supposedly rules-based world order, as we at Declassified have tried to document. What about all those wars, all those British conflicts in places like Iraq and Libya, and all the human rights abusing regimes the UK supports, to name just 2 obvious aspects of the UK's negative impact on the world? This doesn't seem to trouble Guardian writers. To The Guardian, the more the UK does in the world, the better this might be. So Guardian editors recently lamented the government's cuts in overseas aid because this means we throw away our claim to global leadership. Observer editors similarly want to increase Britain's international influence. If it follows that Guardian editors back a large military budget. They wrote in November last year that the case for a spending upgrade is strong and was even a national priority. A reader of The Guardian would naturally get the impression that Britain is a routine supporter of international law and human rights that occasionally goes wayward. But this rose-tinted view, which I think is impervious to the available evidence, also applies to its coverage of the US, the UK's key ally. So The Guardian was brutally critical of just about everything that President Trump did or said, rightly, but it heaped praise on his predecessor, Obama, through all his numerous wars, and now writes a stream of supportive and even obsequious articles about Joe Biden and his offer of hope and light, as Guardian editors put it last year. Basically, the paper has shown itself to be largely a devotee of Anglo-American liberal power, with editors recently welcoming even the opportunity for Boris Johnson to be Biden's military ally. To The Guardian, Trump represented a big break with a mythological past. So the editors claimed in January last year, Washington once championed international law to manage global relations, but under Trump, it promotes the law of the jungle. The faith that Observer editors are willing to place on Biden has actually been extraordinary, even by their standards. After Biden's first foreign policy speech as president in February, Observer editors noted that, quote, Biden's way is the diplomatic way, not the way of war, and that his, quote, recommitment to multilateralism represented long-standing American policy objectives. 3 weeks later, Biden bombed Syria, ordering airstrikes against Iranian-backed forces in the country. That's the first trend. The second trend that I've identified in the research is that The Guardian doesn't truly cover its own government's role in the world. It doesn't truly cover UK foreign policy. The paper gives a very partial picture of the UK's true role in the world. Whole areas of UK foreign policy are excluded from its coverage. So regular Guardian columnists hardly cover UK foreign policy and reveal even less, but they all seem to write endlessly about the US, badly. If you take the example of Israel and Egypt, so The Guardian publishes dozens of articles on Israel and regularly criticizes its illegal settlements in the occupied territories, and it regularly calls for the UK to recognize a Palestinian state. But the coverage is remarkable for failing to reveal UK policies backing Israel. I could find no mention at all in the last 2 years of the UK's considerable and increasing military cooperation with Israel, which is easily documented from public sources, or of the UK's increasing trade and investment with Israel. It's actually a similar story with Egypt. So again, The Guardian publishes plenty of articles critical of the relentless repression under the current regime of President Sisi in Egypt. And it has had several articles mentioning the UK's failure to condemn Sisi's human rights abuses. But I could find no articles in the past 2 years detailing actual British support for the Sisi regime, especially deepening military relations that are again in the public domain. These weren't mentioned in 3 editorials on Egypt within the last 2 years. The paper's correspondent in Cairo was even expelled from the country in March 2020. It barely made a difference, as she didn't seem to notice while she was there that the UK was supporting the regime that she was covering. I found only one passing mention in a single article of 218 million worth of UK arms exports to Egypt in the recent years. There are plenty of other examples like that of countries very badly covered. I want to come on to the third trend of Guardian reporting, which is that The Guardian rarely investigates or seeks to reveal UK foreign policies. So The Guardian conducts few original investigations into UK foreign policies, and it gives no impression it wants to truly hold the British government to account for its actions abroad. Very few foreign affairs articles appear to be based on freedom of information requests, for example, which are an obvious way to expose government policies. Any media outlet serious about examining UK intelligence and military policies would regularly investigate Britain's key bases, key military intelligence bases in places like Kenya, Cyprus, Brunei, Belize, for example. The Guardian does almost nothing on those places. The paper has published 5 articles on Belize in the past 2 years, none mentioning the UK military role there. We at Declassified showed the Ministry of Defence is allowed to use 1/6 of Belize's entire territory for jungle warfare training. This was using information already in the public domain. On the dictatorship in Brunei, there have been several articles critical of the Sultan of Brunei's stance on stoning gay people, but no investigations into the UK military forces there and how they keep the Sultan in power. And perhaps most astoundingly, despite 170 articles and videos tagged Kenya in the past 2 years on the Guardian site, I could find no mention of the extensive UK military presence in the country, which involves hundreds of troops, British troops, and 13 separate training grounds available for British troops, which is something that my colleague at Declassified, Phil Miller, has documented. The 4th trend of reporting. The Guardian covers a small number of issues reasonably well, but often within limits. So, different to the right-wing UK press, The Guardian regularly covers and takes a critical line on issues like, for example, UK arms sales to Saudi Arabia and other human rights abuses, on MI5 and MI6 collusion and torture, and on a subject like the UK's dispossession of the Chagos Islanders. The paper is also by far the most interested in the British press in covering UK tax havens and Britain's role in global tax avoidance. And also some major historical issues like the British Empire and the slave trade are consistently covered critically. Now, I think it's this coverage that probably explains why liberal readers value The Guardian and regard it as different to the overtly establishment billionaire-owned media. That's the good side of The Guardian. But there are limits to what the paper covers or reveals, even on these issues that it covers reasonably well. If you take the Yemen war, there have been plenty of articles on the Yemen war and the British arms exports to Saudi Arabia fueling it. And Guardian editors have correctly mentioned the UK's, quote, utter disregard for the lives of Yemenis. But the true extent of the UK's role in facilitating the Yemen war, especially the activities of the Royal Air Force and arms corporation BAE Systems in Saudi Arabia, has barely been covered in the paper. UK ministers have been complicit in war crimes in Yemen since 2015, but they've been let off the hook as much by The Guardian as the rest of the media. And what happened when a political leader came along who might have transformed UK policy towards Saudi Arabia, towards the Yemen war and elsewhere? Well, what happened is that The Guardian and The Observer devoted huge space during Jeremy Corbyn's leadership of the Labour Party to undermine the prospect of a government led by him as he posed the biggest ever challenge to establishment power. The paper's overtly hostile stance towards Corbyn was widely noted, and it all but accused him of being anti-Semitic, while consistently demonising the Labour leadership for allegedly failing to address anti-Semitism in the party. Now, a study by the Media Reform Coalition found that Guardian reporting on anti-Semitism in Labour involved false statements or assertions of facts and a systematic pattern of highly contentious claims by sources that were not duly challenged or qualified in news reports. The Guardian's selective coverage of key issues to promote a political agenda is also illustrated in recent reporting on the UK's new military strategies. So the UK government has recently announced something major and deeply worrying. Its new military strategy says the UK armed forces will be, quote, more active around the world to combat threats of the future and be globally engaged, constantly campaigning. Britain's Defence Secretary Ben Wallace said something extraordinary to Parliament just a few days ago. He said the British military will no longer be held as a force of last resort, but will become a more present and active force around the world, moving seamlessly from operating to warfighting. Now, this emphasis on warfighting has hardly been noted by The Guardian. In fact, several of its articles have preferred to lament cuts to the Army, Navy, and Air Force. The same complaint actually as the right-wing media. This is at a time when the UK has the fourth largest military budget in the world, bigger than Russia. So here we have Boris Johnson's government explicitly outlining plans to fight more wars and deploy more military force across the world. But these declarations have been barely or not at all noticed by the country's leading liberal media outlet. So what's the fifth trend? The Guardian regularly acts as a platform for the security state. So while The Guardian publishes occasional articles which are usually mildly critical of Britain's intelligence agencies, GCHQ and MI6, it just as frequently runs puff pieces on them. In fact, GCHQ seems to hold a special place at The Guardian. Recent articles are headlined, GCHQ releases most difficult puzzle ever in honor of Alan Turing. And GCHQ aims to attract recruits with Science Museum's spy exhibition. It's noticeable that the paper hardly conducts any investigations into the role of the UK's intelligence agencies abroad, and criticism of them appears very rarely in editorials. Now, my colleague at Declassified, Matt Kennard, and I have previously revealed how The Guardian has been successfully targeted by the UK intelligence agencies to neutralize its reporting of the security state. And this happened after The Guardian revealed the secret documents supplied by Edward Snowden in 2013. Nowadays, the paper regularly acts as a credulous amplifier of often unsubstantiated claims by British intelligence and military figures about the threat posed by Russia and China. The Guardian has actually published 758 articles tagged Russia in the past year alone, a helpful focus on the British state's #1 official enemy. It's not that Russia doesn't deserve critical attention, clearly it does, especially in the light of its illegal occupation of the Crimea, its domestic authoritarianism, the likely role of the Kremlin in foreign assassinations, including in Britain. These are obviously serious issues, but Whitehall also has interests in exaggerating the threat to the UK posed by Moscow, and The Guardian, rather than seeking to expose that, appears more willing to act as a conduit for the state's media operations. And the paper's coverage of the war in Syria falls into the same category. So dozens of articles in the paper rightly condemn the Assad regime's war crimes. But there are few which expose the nature of the largely jihadist opposition to Assad. Moreover, the Guardian has recently all but excised the UK's own role in Syria's war. The evidence suggests that Britain began covert operations in Syria to help overthrow Assad in late 2011 or early 2012, but I could find no mention in the past 2 years of Britain's years-long covert war, which was undertaken with its US and Arab allies. The Guardian prefers a different line. Recent articles and editorials have constantly lamented that the UK has failed to act to stop Syria's war, ignoring the fact that British covert action very likely helped to prolong it. What's especially bizarre about this is that The Guardian itself in the past uncovered some of the aspects of the UK covert action programme in Syria. So prominent columnist Simon Tisdall wrote just last month that in countries like Syria and Libya during the Arab Spring of 2011, as events turned unpredictable and Islamists got involved, the West backed away. In fact, the reality is the opposite. It was then that the Western intelligence agencies began working alongside Islamist forces, seeking to overthrow Assad and Gaddafi in Libya, a policy which served to empower hardline and jihadist groups. Now, it follows with this mode of reporting that The Guardian has run more pieces in the past 2 years on Russian opposition figure Alexei Navalny than on imprisoned publisher Julian Assange. I mean, Assange is incarcerated in a maximum security prison 14 miles from The Guardian's office. The paper now publishes editorials and articles arguing against extraditing Assange to the US, Much of this likely comes from external pressure. So last October, Wise Up, a solidarity group for Assange, staged a demonstration outside the Guardian's office to protest against the paper's failure to support Assange in the US extradition case. The paper's current support of Assange, which is strong, follows years of demonizing him. There are at least 44 articles since 2010 with negative headlines about Assange, and there was an apparent campaign in The Guardian conducted in 2018 falsely casting Assange as an agent of Russia. And it culminated in a false front-page fantasy story about Paul Manafort secretly meeting Julian Assange, which remains on The Guardian's website over 2 years later. It's not difficult to despise Julian Assange, an Observer editorial in April 2019 began, just after Assange had been dragged from the Ecuadorian embassy. And an opinion piece by columnist Hadley Freeman was published comparing Assange to a rotten fish that needed to be thrown out. And despite the implications for media freedom posed by the US prosecution of Assange, and despite the fact that The Guardian itself financially benefited from WikiLeaks' previous exposures, the paper has done almost nothing to investigate the obvious legal conflicts of interest in the Assange case, which so obviously point to a stitch-up. So those are the 5 trends that, in my view, come through strongly in The Guardian's reporting in its coverage of foreign affairs over the last 2 years. I'm conscious I'm not covering everything The Guardian does, and I'm certainly not covering its domestic reporting. But I think what it shows is this. The Guardian's more critical, independent reporting is real on certain issues, but it fails to cover key issues, and it tends to offer only limited dissent. And this means that its critical takes, when they occur, are usually within boundaries that do not reveal the true role of the government and state in the world, and that actually protect the establishment from proper scrutiny and challenge. The paper's political positioning is on the right wing of Labour and at the mainstream of the US Democratic Party. And this positioning has always suggested that The Guardian would act to stave off more fundamental change when the time came. And with Corbyn, that was clearly borne out. I think all the evidence suggests that The Guardian can be considered the media representative and the ideological pillar of the liberal wing of the British establishment. It's as much a defender of Anglo-American power and power projection as the right-wing establishment media, and is especially supportive of the UK's foreign wars and interventions and the global influence that it claims that the UK has lost. So the organisation Media Lens, which has examined The Guardian for 20 years now, has consistently exposed how The Guardian acts to limit dissent, showing how it performs an effective propaganda function for the state. Media Lens argues, correctly in my view, that the paper's more progressive writers falsely convey the idea that progressive change can be achieved by working within profit-maximizing corporations that are precisely the cause of so many of our crises. And The Guardian is coming under more and more scrutiny, illustrated by the book that Des Friedman has just edited, Capitalism's Conscience, which this conference is largely based around. I think analyses like this and others show that while The Guardian sometimes exposes how the British establishment works, it largely acts in support of it. And that in recent years, it has largely shredded the capacity that it once had to do more independent and more investigative reporting. And I just wanted to end with this. Overall, I think it's clear The Guardian and The Observer provide a misleading picture of what the UK does in the world. One might think, okay, well, at least The Guardian is better than the right-wing media. But my view is that The Guardian's role is just as pernicious as that of the right-wing media, and may in fact be worse. People are increasingly aware that the right-wing billionaire-controlled press are routinely slavish mouthpieces of the establishment. But The Guardian is just as bad or worse because it co-opts liberal and progressive-minded people into thinking they're being told the truth. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Mark. I was sort of mentally waiting for applause, which is what that talk deserves. So that was really brilliant. And I hope, as one of the questioners asks, Ian Sinclair says, what a great talk. What and how much you reveal that would be of great interest to Guardian readers. Do you think there are any chances of this speech being reported in the Guardian newspaper tomorrow? I think question. I'm going to bunch them together, but that's just also a response to the brilliance of that revealing talk. And I think in a way, people need to go to the declassified website to see the implications of a lot of this and the analysis that lies behind it. So I think we should go straight on to the questions. So the first, the one is about the Guardian itself reporting on this speech, which I hope it does, but I don't hold my breath. Maybe you can get it into the comments section. Next question is from Patrick Elliott. He's asked, how important is the role played by the Guardian in manufacturing consent to US-backed regime changes overseas, particularly in Latin America? Then the third question is from Bathia Barber. What interventions in the production process would result in a more critical narrative output? I assume you mean the production process of The Guardian. I'm not sure. Anyway, so those are the first three. So, Mark, maybe first, how do you assess the chances of you getting into The Guardian in some way?
Yeah, I'd assess those chances as being fairly slim, Hilary. What I can say is that a version of this speech is going to be published in The Guardian. It is going to be published not in The Guardian, but in Declassified UK on Monday. Actually, that's where we're publishing the results of the research that I've done, which the talk that I've just given was based on. So people can read a slightly more detailed analysis there on Monday. Just to come on to some of the other questions then. Yeah, I mean, in terms of the Guardian's reporting on US-backed regime change in Latin America, I mean, it has been striking, I think, particularly most recently, obviously, in Venezuela and Bolivia. I think some of the reporting has been quite poor. It has largely whitewashed, I think, the US role, particularly in Venezuela. It's not that we should be adopting a view that sees Maduro's government in Venezuela as being a fantastic government. But what's clearly the case is that the US wants to utterly overthrow it and will do anything to do that. And The Guardian has largely, I think, played along with that kind of agenda. And it's not offered very much, in my view, critical analysis of just what the US's real aims are in that part of the world. I think you could say a very similar thing about, its coverage of Bolivia. Clearly there has been a major. The paper has had some articles that refer to a coup in Libya. There has been some comment articles on that, which I think is sort of fairly reflected what actually did happen in Bolivia, which was there was a coup towards the end of 2019. But I don't think it was particularly well documented at the time. I think at the time, The Guardian tended to go along with this idea that there wasn't a coup and that it was all perfectly normal, and that there was the changing government was sort of quite legitimate, which is what the US and UK governments were arguing at the time. So I do think the coverage was quite misleading. In terms of the question that someone asked about the interventions in the production process, I think the most important intervention that The Guardian can make is actually to employ some journalists, because it's clearly not at the moment, or at least not journalists as I would understand them. It seems that, as I was saying in the talk, it seems that there's really very few investigations actually going on. it seems that there's very, very little intent to actually examine and reveal what UK governments are doing in the world. What I see is a lot of puff pieces, a lot of mildly critical material being written, but there's no real evidence of any desire to uncover what the UK is actually doing in the world. And if people look at the Guardian website's coverage of UK foreign policy, and then they look at, say, Declassified, I mean, my organization's website, where we are genuinely trying to expose and reveal what the UK government is doing in the world, I think people will see a vast gulf, of difference. And it's not like we've got access to privy information that no one else has. Most of our material, most of the work that we do, in fact, 99.9% of it is based on material that's already in the public domain. So in order to get that material together and to publish, you need to be primarily interested in wanting to do it. It doesn't take, it's not a process of rocket science. You have to be interested in uncovering what the UK is doing in the world. And I just do not see that at the Guardian at the moment. Rather, what I see is a lot of amplification of what the state's priorities are, and a lack of willingness to upset too much what the British authorities are really doing around the world. So that's the intervention process they need to undertake. They need to start employing journalists and actually to initiate an ethos of informing the public about what is being done by the UK and the world. But I fear it won't happen because the Guardian is a corporation that primarily seeks, the same as the rest of the corporate media, it primarily seeks to make profits, and it also has a political agenda to make sure that things don't change too much. So I actually, although I would like to see the Guardian reporting properly on the UK's role in the world, I'm not expecting it, and people shouldn't expect it to either. What they should do instead is to follow independent media, because it's independent media who are likely to be exposing going forward what our governments actually do.
Well into a set of questions that are really about explaining, these features of the Guardian, these limits of the Guardian, and how far it's changed. I mean, many of us remember, the great Richard Norton Taylor, who was a journalist of the kind, or is, I mean, he's alive and kicking, is a journalist of the kind that you talk about. So the questions, and obviously I think there needs to be some discussion of the trust, the Scott Trust, which distinguishes the Guardian from a normal corporation. So that's a question in effect that Will Long asks: what role might the Guardian's ownership, governance and business model, perhaps through paid content, online advertising, have on its output, and what changes in these might improve its journalism? Then Richard Spence asks, how much effect has a change of leadership or personnel at the Guardian had on its coverage? And then Becky Gardner, I assume, has asked, do you have views on what the mechanisms are that police the boundaries that you talk about? Maybe there's a fourth question which could link into this. What's your take on the current censorship and filtering employed by tech companies in regard of independent media being able to compete with corporate media? But we could leave that till later. But so those three questions about explaining the Guardian's character.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of how much has the Guardian changed, I mean, it has changed, I think, considerably over the last 5 years. There was a time, and you mentioned Richard Norton Taylor, great journalist, now more than happy for him to be sitting on the board of Declassified. Richard's a great source of advice and has for 40 years been covering defense and security issues brilliantly. There's no place for him at the Guardian anymore. Ian Cobain, another brilliant investigative journalist, now working with Middle East Eye, did great work at the Guardian. No place for him anymore. There are many other Guardian Guardian journalists who have left in recent years, and I think that my understanding is that they've left partly because from being at least partly seeing itself as a public service kind of information provider, and is now sort of very overtly a part of the establishment. And that's clearly in evidence over the last 5 years. I mentioned the article that Matt Kennard and I did for declassified a couple of years or so ago now. It become, when you look at its coverage of the UK security services and Russia, it's very clear that the stance has changed. The Guardian now regularly acts as simply as a platform and an amplifier for the views of the security state. It gets these exclusive interviews with the heads of agencies. I think there's one in the paper today, a GCHQ puff piece again, from the director of GCHQ. This happens all the time. And so there's a lack of willingness to apply independent, basic journalistic standards, actually. That's what we're talking about here, about providing balancing material, critical material, when it's okay to carry what the heads of security agencies say. It can be news, provided it's balanced with some independent analysis of what those agencies actually do in the world. And the latter bit is something that's very often missing now in Guardian reporting. This is simply, not a balanced public service information provider. Rather, as I say, it's become part of the establishment kind of reporting, virtually indistinguishable, in my view, from most of the right-wing media. In terms of the ownership, I mean, this is an important point. I don't think that corporate media can ever provide a public service. I mean, they simply, their aims are to make large amounts of money and to break into new markets, to get ever more numbers of readers, to expand. All these things, they compromise journalism. It's the independent media outlets these days, the smaller ones, not just declassified, but others, who are doing the much more incisive, independently minded work. And I don't actually see any way back for these big corporations because they're corporations. And that's why I would make a plea to people to not only to support independent media and read and follow independent media and help them to become as good as possible. But I would also make a plea to progressive writers to work for those independent media as well and to support them and not to support corporate media organizations, because you're part of an increasingly illegitimate system, which is really just part of the establishment's information operations. I think plays a very pernicious role in our society. What the public really needs is completely impartial and journalists who are unencumbered by their funding mechanisms, just like we are. Our funding mechanisms are from the public and they're from independent trusts and foundations. We're not interested in taking money from corporations or governments or others who could compromise the choices of issues that we decide, the issues that we decide to work on and the way that we decide to work on them. I think that this is a major problem with the corporate media. I'm not sure I've answered the third question, Hilary. I'm not sure I can quite remember it, actually.
Do you have a view are the police boundaries that you talk about? But I'm wondering whether, as you think about that one, you should say more about how the sort of Scott Trust model, which is not quite the same as a corporate model, has in a way failed, because presumably it was set up to provide a means of governance sort of distinct from a private corporation and in theory to protect the public service function of the Guardian. I mean, maybe in answer to Will Long's question, one should say a little bit more about why that's failed, but then that links to Becky's question about wait a minute, just get it again. Do you have views on what the mechanisms are that police the boundaries you talk about?
Yeah, I mean, I should say I don't know very much about the Scott Trust model. I mean, all I, what I'm looking at is the outputs as a reader, as a punter, if you like.
Sure.
So I think the actual structure, I mean, clearly it has not worked. If the aim is to have a genuine public information provision service, but I don't think that is the aim of the Guardian. I don't think the aim of the Guardian is to inform the public what the UK government is doing in the world. The aim of the Guardian is to make money and to promote a political agenda. In that, I don't think it's any different than other corporate media outlets. The political agenda might be slightly different. As I say, The Guardian is the liberal wing of the establishment, whereas the Telegraph and the Times would be the sort of the right wing of the establishment. But essentially, all those corporate media have a common interest in making sure that the status quo is pretty much in place. And you only have to look at The Guardian's coverage of Jeremy Corbyn. And I just wanted to actually highlight some key facts that I uncovered in previous research, actually, because I think this is quite relevant, because whatever you think about Jeremy Corbyn, whether you're a supporter or not a supporter, the fact was Corbyn's foreign policy agenda represented something potentially very different for the UK. And The Guardian's approach to Corbyn was very instructive. It ran 1,215 stories mentioning Labour and anti-Semitism from January 2016 to September 2019. In the 3 months in the run-up to the December 2019 election, The Guardian had 164 articles covering Corbyn and anti-Semitism. And in fact, The Guardian had 4 articles on Corbyn and anti-Semitism in the week of the election in December 2019, just in case no one had completely got the message by then, the message that The Guardian was sending out about Corbyn and anti-Semitism, up until that point. This was an extraordinary focus on one issue, and I think it can only be explained as being part of a political agenda to stop Corbyn being elected. And I think there's other examples of campaigns being run by the paper which certainly coincide with the establishment agenda. And I mentioned the Assange issue as well. I mean, clearly The Guardian ran, well, my view is that the evidence suggests that The Guardian also ran a campaign to demonize Julian Assange throughout 2018, just before he was expelled from the embassy. I think those two cases illustrate that these papers have political agendas, which are very different than an approach that would be taken if the real aim was to inform the public about the reality on these issues. So I actually think that the fundraising objectives and the political objectives outweigh very strongly the public information provision objectives in terms of how The Guardian currently operates. And as I say, I don't hold out the prospect things will change very much, because the organization is just too big. It's too big and too corporate. People should look towards independent media for changes. And I think it's actually us, when we talk about mechanisms that will change the media, I think it's largely readers who should, for those who haven't already, should probably wake up a bit as to how the papers actually function. I do think there needs to be mechanisms in the UK to hold the media outlets better to account. I mean, at the moment we have this organization called IPSO, which really does not hold media outlets to account. It identifies occasional instances where journalists might deviate from the editor's code of conduct, but it only gives papers a rap on the knuckles when it deviates from those codes. The fact is that newspapers, the British media, are telling untruths, providing misinformation and disinformation all the time, and no one formally is holding them to account for that. And I do think there needs to be a mechanism to enable that, a far stronger one than we currently have in the form of IPSO. But I think it's also people power and moving away from these corporate media that really is also the key thing that people should be encouraged to do, and to inform themselves. It's in their own self-interest. You're not going to find out what the UK government is doing in the world by reading The Guardian or reading the Times or reading the Telegraph.
Okay, Mark, thank you. Just with regard to that last point about the independent media, I just want to give a little plug to Red Pepper, the part of the independent media that I represent. That in the next issue, we're actually going to be publishing a brilliant article by Richard Gott, who's another journalist who used to work for The Guardian, in fact was the comment editor, who needs an honourable mention. So make sure you get to the next Red Pepper. I'll put the website and the subscription details in the chat. So just continuing the questions. So maybe let's move on to that one that I mentioned at the end. What's your take from Craig Chambers? What's your take on the current censorship and filtering in companies in regard of independent media, which you're stressing, being able to compete with corporate media?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's clearly an issue what is happening. I mean, the definitions of what constitutes political are clearly being applied differently by some of the tech companies. Twitter, for example, when you see what they consider to be political and what's acceptable, I think it is a fear and it is a danger. And I do think that there does need to be a move by independent media organizations to establishing our own platforms outside of these big tech companies to be able to communicate with readers. I mean, clearly that is a fairly major task in itself, but there are various mechanisms that are going on, which at least I'm aware of, which are very important ones. For example, the Independent Media Association, which is a very important, increasingly important body, which is working with a range of independent media groups in the UK, I know is involved in discussions to try and develop more coordinated activities to help and nurture the independent media sector in the UK as the Independent Media Association. So it'll be interesting to see how that develops. I think it's time that people who are concerned about promoting independent media, whether on the left, centre or the right, actually group together more to promote the sector and to actually put serious money behind it. Rather than simply complaining about how the media currently does not serve the public interest, what actually needs is serious funding being put behind the media outlets. Because, you Hilary at Red Pepper and me at Declassified and others in the other independent media organizations, we know how hard it is to run our organizations on pretty low budgets. I mean, Declassified has a budget which is 1,122 times smaller than The Guardian. That's what we're competing with. I would argue that we work much more in the public interest than The Guardian does. And I would say that most independent media organizations do as well. But serious funding needs to go into those independent media groups. Otherwise, we will end up with corporate media dominating everything.
It's another question that actually, in a way, you've answered, and I would very much agree with you. Maybe we'll move on to others, but Will Long says, is there more independent media can do to cooperate and maximise reach and impact? And I think we both say yes, and maybe that should be another discussion that Goldsmiths can organise about how that can be done. Because we've only got 6 minutes and there are many other questions. There's a follow-up question from Vasia Barber. How much agency do Guardian journalists have to be critical, though? I mean, given your criticism of them, she's coming back. And what are the forces restraining their agency? Can lack of willingness be the only issue? Then there's another different kind of question, your basic argument. Just interested, from Andrew Cole, just interested to know whether you think any UK intervention abroad is positive, or would you actually prefer the UK to confine itself to UK issues alone? There are one or two more questions, but I think that's probably all we've got time for.
Yeah, I mean, I think on the issue of agency, well, what's interesting about that is that there are some good journalists at The Guardian. There are some people writing good material. I mean, I think, George Monbiot's work on the environment over the years has been very enlightening and very useful. I think Aditya Chakraborty's work on various domestic issues has been very useful over the years. Rob Evans' work on spy cops has been very good. And I think that, these writers show that it is possible to write, independently, even within the corporate media. But what I also know is that when you talk to people within the corporate media, there is a limit to how far they can go. And there's certainly a limit to the number of independent writers that any of these corporate media outlets are prepared to tolerate. So, you know, most of the output is less independent. It is much more part of a system of misinformation or disinformation, or just very mainstream. So the space to do critical work is there, but is small and I would say declining. But it should be the task of. But what that shows is that it is possible to write critical material even from within the system. But I would still urge people not so much to do that. If you're a freelance journalist, write for the independent media. Don't write for the corporate media, because the independent media are the bodies who are most likely to nurture and protect and want to develop and preserve that kind of work. Just very quickly, because we're right at the end, just on the issue of can any UK intervention be positive? I think there actually have been a couple of examples over the decades of some positive UK interventions, admittedly not very many. Virtually all UK wars and interventions since 1945 have had majorly negative impacts on the people in the countries concerned. There's so many examples of that. But I think if you take, one classic example is Sierra Leone in the year 2000. There was a very small number of British troops deployed in Freetown. They genuinely helped to reduce the prospects of a bloodbath, another bloodbath occurring in the context of Sierra Leone's civil war at the time. It actually showed that it can be the case that the deployment of military force can have a positive impact. It just doesn't have very much. Just doesn't happen very much, and it's not really on the agenda of British policymakers either, because most of the configuration of British military forces is really for warfighting, and increasingly so, as I was mentioning in the talk. And for decades, the major powers like the UK and the US have been avoiding the prospect for an international army, say, an international military force that could actually provide some kind of independent mechanism to intervene in conflicts around the world in a more neutral way than we currently are able to have. But the UK and the US have never been interested in that. Neither of the other permanent members of the Security Council, Russia and China either, but certainly the UK and the US haven't either. So basically, no, the UK is not a progressive force when it comes to projecting its power, but there have been a couple of examples when you could argue the opposite.
It's now sadly, but your talk and the discussion and the questions has made happening to the conference, because many of the issues raised, and I'm sorry we haven't got more time to answer all the questions, but the ones on foreign policy, for example, if you come to the workshop tomorrow with Victoria Britton and others on foreign news, those can be pursued. Then on the whole question of the kind of role of how far the Guardian is like a corporation. Is it simply a profit-making organisation, a money-making organisation, or could it put purpose before profit? There's a keynote tomorrow morning at 10. More Than a Business: 200 Years of a Newspaper Which Put Purpose Before Profit, with Alan Rusbridger and chaired by Natalie Fenton. So this is a really good opening. So thanks very, very much, and thanks everybody for their questions. And sorry I haven't been able to get to all of them, but we've got another day of really good discussion. So hopefully see you next year at something, where we can actually be in the flesh. Thanks.